Tell me what you found in Nevada.
There, it was a bit of a, as I already told you, first draft was a throwaway. And so then I started to think about the thematic clusters and then tried to find examples from states that would reinforce the point, but subject to some constraints, like at least one per state and enough to make that chapter come to life. And so in Nevada, I was there and I visited a big picture learning school. I don't know, do you guys know, anybody know what big picture learning is? I mean, these are Dennis Littke and Elliot Washer, and they go back with the Met schools, and they just do really great things with an emphasis on advisory, so there's a connection between an adult in the school and the kid, internships, and lots of project work. And I just am a big fan of what they've done. And so I visited Innovations High School in Reno, and then wrote about that, where so many of these kids who've, I can't really overemphasize how many kids get this message from school that they're not very smart when they actually have remarkable gifts. And, and I tried to draw that out in a different way. I mean, Utah, I talk about this woman who has this great program for dyslexics and how dyslexics are told over and over again. And I'm very sensitive to it. My wife's an acute dyslexic, and this was back when nobody really even knew what that was. But she spent years and years in schools being told she's dumb, like you're just never going to amount to anything. And it's heartbreaking because the kids in different ways get this message over and over again. And so many of those kids, when they had a chance to do more, just like we were saying with FIRST Robotics or the drone project, when they're working collaboratively on projects, they find their lane, they find their path and their distinctive way to make a positive contribution, and they begin to get that conviction. I matter. I can actually do some things that are going to make my world better. And so that was the anecdote I chose to profile out of Nevada. As I say, I just sort of tried to piece together different things. And I was lucky, as I said, because every day was so cram-jammed, I was able to find, not so much from my efforts, but just from the help I got from a lot of people, find just a lot of great things in a school year of travel.
There's a whole lot going on there as well, especially focused on teachers, and something even last night was happening in the state. There was a conference, and it was sponsored by National Board, the network that is there. And what is happening within, especially Clark County, because it is the largest school district in the state, is that they have something called embedded professional development and professional development schools. And it was part of our Network to Transform Teaching, which is a seed grant from the Department of Education supporting effective educator development, that National Board chose this place in the sense that they had all the support from K-12 through higher ed, their superintendent, as well as the state level individuals who were part of this, to say, we're going to focus on what teachers need and give them the supports that they need, but also give them an incentive to say, how do I increase my knowledge of students, of pedagogy, and how I go about my work, but how I work with my colleagues to understand better. So our first core proposition of board certification is teachers are committed to their students and their learning, and you can't teach who you don't know. And children, when they walk in the door, it's like they have radar. They know exactly how you feel about them. They know if you think they're smart or not. They know if you like them or not. They know if you feel like they're worth your time. And one of the things about board certified teachers and going through the process that I love myself is that focus on who these children are and meeting them where they are and making sure that the minute they walk in the door, they feel a sense of being wanted, welcomed, and having high expectations of who they are and what they can do. And there's no stopping them there. And I saw this so many times in the book, and I always said to myself, I'm never asking for permission or forgiveness. I don't need either one of those from anybody. I am going to do what I know is right, and instinctively, I think teachers do that on a daily basis in their classroom because you meet you make so many decisions in an hour or the 90 minutes that you have with students, even though you know there's something looming back here that you have to cover this material. And I think teachers now are arming themselves with the fact that their jobs are extremely complex. And the complexity of that job is now allowing them to do the instinctive pieces of work that they weren't able to do before because somebody was dictating the every minute of their class time. And they're getting results doing that. So in Clark County, they have seen a 98% retention rate with teachers where, people were leaving, 50% of teachers would leave, especially in high need schools. I was with some teachers a couple of months ago at a network event, and they are so excited about their work and their ability to work in conjunction with each other, share best practices, see each other teach, and be a part of networks and study and real research that matters. So when I hear you talk in the book about talking with teachers, that they're not, and I can't remember exactly what you said about when you ask somebody about their high school career, what is the first thing they tell you that they remember? It's not, oh yeah, I remember that one stupid thing that I had to do. They will remember things that they did, not things they memorized. And those experiences that were lasting. And when we would take our kids through thematic learning activities, they would, even today, I would say 2 words, and they would finish the sentence about what that was about and how it made them feel and what they learned, because it's like smelling peppermint. You know where you were the first time you smelled it, you know when you hear a certain song where you were, how old you were. And that's what doing and learning in that way brings back to students.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so important.
When I visit schools, I'll often focus on a couple things. I'll say, and this is true, I mean, even schools that I am enthusiastic about, there's still a fair amount of, what I call, memorizing material, replicating low-level procedures, and following instructions. And I tell them, I am almost certain if a kid is great at that, they will be on your honor roll. But I'm curious, do you have evidence of real learning? Can you convince me that kids have actually retained what they're studying? And the only time I get any evaluation of that, any investigation, which is quite happenstance and anecdotal, people come back and say they didn't retain it. Like when you just study cram, we test at the exact worst time to know anything, right? Is after 48 hours of cramming. So that's one thing, is I don't think we have real evidence that the more conventional model is really leading to work. The second question I have is, if your main goal in school was to increase students' interest in the subject, how would that change things? And it's what, when you're at the Maker Faire, you walk around the Hall of Science. I mean, I think that's the magic of what you're doing with this organization, is it gets kids excited. Now, is that the only, you need to take that further. But if a kid is bored and hates a topic, it's game over, right? I mean, nobody learns anything once they've decided they hate the topic. And when you think about the difference between checking off the boxes, covering vast swaths of material just to say you covered it, and then you look at how little actually sticks, versus just getting kids very excited about whether, science or history or so many kids, when I interview them and I say, what'd you learn in your history class, will say, I learned I never want to take another history class. What have we accomplished with that, right? And I really think it's a fair point, which is if they don't like it and if they're not retaining it, what's the point, right? What's the point? And so I think that, and it's one of the things I said Friday, I spoke out at their event, the Maker Faire on Friday and Sunday, but I said, the spirit that is reflected in the great work you do, that needs to become the heart and soul of school. That can't be just something you do on an occasional weekend or after school, because once and you see it, some of your examples are so powerful, is once a kid says it's important and it's interesting, it's like Katie barred the door. And that, by the way, is not that the rich kids do it and the poor kids don't.
Right.
Actually, it sort of works the opposite way, because a lot of those rich kids have been ruined by, helicopter parents, and,
Yeah.
and they need a different sort of help.
When I turn on my computer every morning, I have this little sticky that I put on the side that says, schooling is for compliance, education is for liberation. And the fact that as a teacher, when we think about what we do on a daily basis and what we face at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, is very different than the middle of the day. You talked about one of the schools and their definition of success.
Oh, yeah.
And what success really means, and it goes back to what you just said about, I know it for 48 hours maybe, but I know nothing after that. And I'll have to give you a case in point. I had two identical twins. They were co-valedictorians, and both went to Princeton. And there was an IB school. We were an engineering school. There was an IB school across town, which they were our rivals, they thought. I can't imagine why they thought they were. We were engineering, and they were IB. But they ended up at Princeton at the same time. And they ran into each other on campus, and they were saying to the twins, Leah and Daniela, how are you doing? And they said, we're making straight A's. How are you doing? And he was getting booted out of school, even though he had done all of this stuff and on paper had straight A's from his IB school, but could not cope there because they had learned how to work in teams, they learned how to work together, they learned how to meet deadlines, but they learned how to transfer knowledge and connect it in ways that were not isolated to one particular, content area that they could transfer. And they were, and still are, amazing young women in what they've gone on to do. So when you think about, I think about Linda Darling Hammond, and I think about John Dewey.
Yeah.
And Linda Darling Hammond wrote a paper, I think in 1990, and what she was writing about and talking about in the formation of the National Board in 1986, because she was one of those original people, a part of it, was you talked about a nation at risk. And a nation at risk was written, and then National Board was formed out of a nation prepared. And Linda was talking about the fact that everything that she was writing about, everything that they were doing to form the National Board, Dewey had written about in 1900, saying this would be the ideal 21st century. So how do we get, and you talked a little bit about it, schools to understand and make the connection to what children actually need right now and give voice to teachers to get it done and to voice at a table. You talked about voice in decision making and voice in curriculum, voice in budgeting. How do we spend vast amounts of money not in the classroom to just overemphasize, I'm going to tell you in this bureaucratic way what to do, how to do it, and when to do it.
Yeah. Well, but I'd like to start with the why and why it's so important. And people often say to me, sometimes they say to me I'm crazy because I'm in a hotel room 275 nights a year, and I don't charge for anything. And people say, how'd you get so interested in education? And I say, actually, what I'm interested in is democracy. What I'm interested in is a healthy, functioning civil society. But I think the foundation is education. And if we have millions and millions of kids going through school, particularly with skyrocketing college costs, and if a college degree suddenly becomes mandatory to even get to the starting point of life, life's prospects, and if our kids aren't being educated well for career, and if our kids are being terribly educated for citizenship, we're going to live with those consequences. Now, I started saying that 8 years ago, and 8 years ago, people thought I'd lost it. Actually, I mean, I was in in venture capital, I'd kind of retired, and people, when I started saying that to friends, if schools don't change urgently and profoundly, I'm not convinced civil society will hold together. I knew that they were thinking that well, Ted, retirement's not agreeing with him, or something. And I mean, like, nobody wanted to sit near me. I'd go to a cocktail party, there'd be a 10-foot radius, and nobody'd be around. And it was true. I mean, it's true. And but I've made that point in my last 100 talks, and nobody says you're wrong. And the reality is that the world has changed dramatically. And if the world just doesn't value anybody who's good at routine things anymore, and there's still some jobs, but we've sort of gone from lots of jobs to lots of piecemeal drive Uber. I say in a lot of my talks, I mean, it tells us something in America where Uber has its own category for teachers who drive Uber after work to make extra money. I mean, that tells you how we're valuing the most important thing we could do in our schools. So the urgency is sky high, and if we don't get this right, we're gonna look back to today and say this wasn't the worst it's gotten. This, we're just sliding into something where too many people feel adrift and marginalized. Too many people are awash in student loan debt, and they've, as I say, lost that sense of purpose. And so, the how, I actually feel like, and I try to focus on leverage points. So I do a lot. And I'm a big supporter of this thing it could be better, but it's a coalition for access. So if we could rethink college admissions, we would change K through 12 overnight, And so 2 out of the last 3 years, I've given the keynote to 250 college admissions. So and I've funded some innovation grant. I mean, here's a challenge. Try to give an innovation grant to a college admissions office, and you will understand just how uninnovative college admissions is. I mean, you would not believe. It's just dumbfounding. And but just saying to them, if you were more like the Naval Academy, if you said, we're looking for applicants who can convince us that they just don't take no for an answer and they can make positive change in their community, and they'll tell me it's too hard. And I'll say, it's not too hard. And then I tell the story, this is true. In venture capital, for years, and I did well, you can Google me. I never looked at SAT scores. I never looked at grade point. I never asked about that. I didn't care about it. I increasingly got skeptical about kids from the most elite colleges. I always asked for 3 writing samples. I would just say, send me 3 writing samples that will tell me what you want me to know about you. And you can learn so much. And when an admissions officer says it's too hard, I say that's bullshit. I did it for my career. Look at my track record versus yours. You're accepting a lot of kids that aren't really the right kids. And so if we could change that, we'd start changing things. The other thing that I find as I go from college to college or high school to high school is that they celebrate the college path and they denigrate everything else. And that is a very damaging message for our country. And it's not that the poor kids shouldn't be all going to college and all the rich kids could. I mean, I feel like we need to be more like Finland, where lots of paths are respected. And I personally don't see what's so wrong with the kid that says, I've learned how to learn on my own and I know what I want to do in life and I don't have any need for more formal, costly instruction. I think that's something that, but you go to these schools and they'll just be stacked up with the college acceptances. And I say, do you celebrate a kid that's got an apprenticeship and wants to do, whether it's coding directly or car mechanic, it's like, so we start to say it's all in on college. Kids come out of high school with no hireable proficiencies. It's $75 to $300K to get a college degree. And we're just taking an unlevel playing field and tilting it further. And so I feel like, but all that said, I'm optimistic, right? I'm optimistic because the kids' potential is enormous. I always tell people, you want to get really optimistic, spend time with 4-year-olds. I was at Bank Street today, and the younger the kids, the more optimistic you get, because we haven't ruined it yet for them, right? And they do. They learn at warp speed. They ask a million questions. They think outside the box. They don't care about failing because they know that's part of learning. And yet, I have this in my book in North Dakota, where a high school teacher asked juniors in high school, and mine at North Dakota, essentially, what are you interested in? And he said half the kids did a Google search for what should I be interested in.
I know.
And people laugh, but then when you start to think about that, you realize. And and so anyway, so good.